Hi, my name is Crystal Werner, and my group, Guillermo V, Nicholas O, and Benjamin C, we have decided to do a soldering iron for our Tool of the Week tool. What soldering is the process of melting pieces of metal into a joint that is usually a wire. Soldering iron is the main tool in the whole soldering process. It's more or less a heating tool. It heats up the metal and then you put it into whatever you're fixing. This all started back in 1821 in Germany. A neurosurgeon named Ernest Satzes. He claimed to have created the first electric iron soldering. As you can see, the soldering iron is like a pen looking thing with a wire that goes to the main soldering station. The big box looking thing is the soldering station, and there are more bigger ones that allow you to go more in depth with more smaller things. The sponge and the yellow iron wool, it's for cleaning the tip of the soldering iron. You do this to prevent oxidation. The sponge has to be wet though. So what you do is that you damp it into, you practically gently stab the sponge, and then if they're practically dried off with a quick dry with the yellow iron wool, or if there's a small amounts of oxidizing on the tip because it's not cleaned properly or put away properly, the iron wool can just scrape it away if it's not too much. The ring of metal that you see there, this is what you would melt to do soldering with. That blue looking tube thing that you see there, that is used for desoldering, and what that is practically reversing the soldering process. So say that you soldered something and you don't like how it turned out, you can use that. You can heat up the soldering and then use that weird syringe looking thing to suck it up. On the other side, there is a little leveraged thing and a button that controls the whole suction process. The tools that you see here, those are used for the whole wire cutting and everything. The big ones on the other side, it has different measurements for different sizes of wires. And it just makes cutting wires more easy. That small one is for cutting the plastic off the wire so you can do soldering. That right there, the little ring, I don't really know what the name of it is, but it's also used for soldering. If there's like excess soldering, or if there's still some in a hole that you can't get out with the suction, you would use that string looking thing. It looks more of a stringy copper in person, but you would put it down where the soldering is, and then you would press the heat part of the soldering iron on it, and it just sucks up the soldering that's on it. And those last pair of tools right there, they are used for twisting the wires in some sorts of soldering. Like if you're combining two wires together, you would use that to turn the wires, unless you just use your hands. But another use for that tool is also clipping the wires. And that green board looking thing is what I was told, a circuit board. And now you will see me working on an actual resistor. So what I'm doing is that I'm counting the amount of holes on each side and bending it where the fourth marker is, because that's even on both sides on that board anyway. And for this, you have to make sure that it's even on both sides. One thing about when you're soldering something, you need the board or whatever you're working on to not be wobbly. If it moves at any point when you're soldering and you move your tools away, there is a chance that you will get something called dry soldering, which later on could be a cause of short circuiting or something. That's why I have my fingers placed down on the board so it staples it a little bit more. So to solder something, what you need to do is first you gotta test the heat, which I did before actually placing the tools on the board. I tested it on the metal to see if it was hot enough, and then I went in with the soldering iron against what I was soldering, and I heated it up, and then I placed the metal so it's touching the soldering iron and it's also touching the end of the resistor. After giving a few seconds for the time to melt, you move the metal away and then you do the rest with the soldering iron. But for something like this, you don't need to do that much extra, but just make sure that there's enough and that the hole is covered up. For other types of soldering, such as the wires that you see in this picture, it's different from the resistor. So for this one, when you were soldering, it's the exact same process, but this time when you are heating the metal onto the wires, what you want to do is you heat it up so that it's melting, but as soon as its soldering is actually going, you remove the metal just like before, but then with the soldering iron, you move it along the exposed wires so that it's covering all of the wires, and don't worry, it will fall into place. Another thing is be careful when you're doing these ones, because if you do it too low, you will burn the plastic. Also, when soldering, be careful, because sometimes if you don't do it properly, you will get chunks of just excess solder that could cause problems later on, as like I said earlier, short circuiting. There are different types of soldering iron tips. There is bevel hoof tip, chisel tip, conical tip, knife and blade tip. They do the exact same thing. The only thing different is how they're shaped, and they are used depending on what you are fixing. So if you're fixing something smaller, you want to go with a more accurate and smaller tip, such as the knife tip. The people who use the soldering iron are mainly professionals in fields that require soldering irons, such as engineers, obviously. And the safety tips are practically self-explanatory, just like every other lab. Like, don't be stupid, practically. If you're really paranoid about getting hurt, there are heat resistant gloves that you can get, but just be careful. Don't be me. I burnt myself. I burnt myself when I first used it in the lab. So don't be me. Use goggles if you're paranoid. A lot of this is just don't be stupid and just be smart with what you do. But if you're cautious and paranoid, know that there are gloves, there are goggles, and so on and so forth. People who have long hair should tie their hair back. No loose jewelry, just the typical lab safety rules in any lab, really. And that will be all.